so pleased to introduce Michael Schrantz to you. I consider Michael a mentor, a teacher of mine. And Michael has single-handedly helped me understand so much about environmental and home air health. He is absolutely one of the country's top experts as it relates to home health and any mold contamination within the home. This guy's knowledge of how mold can show up in the home, how to find it, how easily it could be missed is on a whole other level. He is the owner of Environmental Analytics, which is the company where he provides services online to help families figure out what's going on. And he's also part of multiple different entities meant to educate the public and physicians about mold. So without any further ado, I welcome you to our discussion on home health and environmental mold. So Mike, let's talk about mold, and let's talk about why both of us care so much about mold, right? Because at least on my end, I think there are some people out there that are like, dude, this guy has just gone off the deep end and we don't know why he cares so much about mold. But mold is a big deal, and I'd love to hear why you care so much about it, and I'll share my piece.
Yeah, absolutely. From an environmental perspective, mold has always been a great surrogate for water damage. We think about homes and exposures in a larger context of what can moisture or dampness do to a home. And a lot of people understand some basic fundamentals that it can create mold and bacteria growth. So mold has always been a useful tool for me in the environment because we work primarily with clients who have an issue with mold exposure, some susceptibility of various types, and mold is something that will show up in a water damaged building, a damp building. And it's a great tool to isolate, to find, if you know how to test that sort of thing, where to locate sources in the home. I've been doing environmental sampling for over 20 years now. And even when we might be looking for other sorts of microorganisms like bacteria, mold has just been a great tool to use to zero in on where it may be coming from the home. In fact, a lot of the inspectors that are out there know more about the physiology of mold than any other type of organism, which makes it a great tool. And it just seems like so many people are impacted by the mold aspect. Oh, not to say it's not more complicated, and you and I both know that. There's other things in an environment, there's other things with health that could be causing additional issues. But mold seems to always be in the conversation, is why we're spending so much time and energy trying to find it, trying to remove it, and trying to create these sanctuaries in the home, which can happen without too much trouble in many cases, if you just take the time to slow down and investigate your environment.
I love that. I love that. And, for me, I realized why I care so much about mold is because there's so much healing that's possible when you can identify it and then treat it and take care of it. And, if mold was, heavens forbid, like cancer, where, for some people, it's a very ugly sentence or diagnosis, I probably would have stayed away from it, because I love having things that could be fixed. And I love having things that can ultimately really help the people that I'm working with. And, I tell all of our families that, minus this being a big pain in your rear end, it's going to take some time, it's going to take some money, it's going to cause some stress. Outside of these things, thank God, mold is something that's completely fixable. And I think that's the whole purpose of the conversation we're having, right, Mike? That it's something that you can address. And there are so many people out there who are suffering in all kinds of different ways. I'll share my experience, and I'm sure you've got thousands of stories. But I have kids who have, horrible learning issues and disabilities, or severe behavioral problems. We're not talking a little behavioral issue, like kids that are just going completely off the deep end, can't regulate, high anxiety, are essentially disabled. And I'm sure this is also applicable to adults. Kids who aren't growing, kids with severe asthma, kids with severe eczema, horrible gastrointestinal issues. There are families where, there are unusual things, like the parent is starting to lose their memory, except they're 35, or, the mom has severe chronic fatigue and she's never been able to figure out why, or someone has a bladder issue and they're peeing every half an hour and they don't understand why. Mold can ultimately impact all of these things. And part of why I care so much about it is once you understand it's there, once you understand what it is doing and you address it, all of these issues can be reversed, which is, I think, the coolest part of this conversation.
Agreed. Agreed. It's a shame. What people tend to post online, social media groups, blogs, you name it, tend to be more towards the fear, the failures, but it's just not representative of what we mainly deal with. What we mainly deal with are the positive stories. And you're right. I think mold is something that is very achievable to address and fix. I think there's a lot of confusion. I know we're going to dive into a couple different talking points naturally, but the theme here is that there definitely is hope and success. And it's not some sort of like 1 in 1,000. I mean, arguably, I think you have a much better chance of fixing your home than you don't. I think where people feel overwhelmed is when all they do read are the failures, or they hear about stories that might insinuate that it's going to be too costly for them. And there's so many options out there. There's so many resources now today, and getting yourself geared up with the right people and the right resources, I think, is admittedly the difference between an almost guaranteed success project versus you just kind of spinning your tires. So yeah, I have hope. Most of the clients I work with, that I'm able to follow with them from the start to the beginning, it's a success story. They were having those symptoms kind of similar to what you were describing. We were able to help figure out where the sources were coming from, naturally remediate those. We discussed different ways of cleaning their environment. There's options out there that don't cost $20,000, $30,000. And then we were able to re-sample the home, reassess the home, and verify that this home now looks significantly better. And gee, go figure, the symptoms started to improve. The biomarkers started to improve. I have way more stories of that than I do of the failures.
Yeah. And that's what drives me. I mean, that's the whole reason why we're having this conversation. One, to empower you guys to know what to do, right? So that at least you can identify it and maybe have some simple tricks you can use to at least start mitigating until you can actually talk to an expert like Mike. And two, to know that you can ultimately have healing. And that's the whole conversation here, that you can heal from mold. You can heal a lot of unusual things that may be happening, from, again, memory problems to, maybe a loved one is having dementia, except the dementia kind of came out of the blue and you have no clue why, or you've got a kid with severe ADHD or anxiety or learning disabilities. And I've seen all of these things. And, the more I work with mold and the more I see what it does to the patients, I mean, it's like a recurring presentation, and it's the same story that keeps presenting itself over and over again, which is why I've become so invested in helping families and kiddos with mold.
Yeah, it's the same issue with us. And I think the other sad part is a lot of people just don't know what environments they're living in. It's complicated. I think the old world mentality was you didn't have a mold problem if you didn't have 10, 20 square feet of mold growing on your wall or somewhere obvious. And even back in those days when that was the case, the quote unquote solution was spraying bleach on it or otherwise focusing on killing it, as if all we were worried about, was disease or pathogenic type issues where, aspergillosis, mold growing in your lungs, that kind of thing. And what we're finding a lot today is that, yeah, there's still the hope and all that, but you have a lot of people that are not even aware of that mold can be a problem in a house where it's hidden. So mold in a wall, mold under a crawl space, mold in an attic space, these sorts of things, and it's not right in front of their face. And I think that's been the real biggest eye opener to a lot of people, maybe some of those listening right now, is that you don't need to have 20 square feet of mold or even a square foot of mold underneath your kitchen sink that's in the living spaces to constitute exposure. Most homes that we deal with, 90+%, those homes, the source is hidden. It's not visible. It's not next to your bed, that kind of a thing. It's in a wall. It's in a roof. It's under a kitchen sink. It's in a crawl space. Mm-hmm. It's in your ductwork. None of these areas are visible in the normal setting.
Well, so when you say the majority, if you were to throw a percentage at it, what percentage of people do you think know that they have? So like when you're in the house, you're like, oh, there's mold here. Like 10%, 20%, 30%? Or flip side, how many people don't know they have mold?
admittedly, we are seeing a change. I think people are evolving, they're learning more, less of the old world mentality is existing. But yeah, I think we're probably seeing 50 to 70% where there's just honest confusion, where a doctor, which normally is how this is initiated, you have somebody who's having symptoms, they go to their doc, says that they think it's mold related. They look at their home visually. The doc may even have them do some DIY sampling just to get a ballpark idea of what might be going on, but they can't see anything. And so they're confused and they're shocked. So loosely, you can say it's 50-50. We do have a lot of people that, like I said, it's evolving. 10 years ago, it was really more like 80-90% of people were confused, but there is so much information out there, and you and I would agree that not all of it's probably that good, but there is so much good information out there as well. It's just sorting through it all. That I would agree. People are more aware and they're awake, and they don't need to be convinced that a house can have hidden sources and still cause exposure just because it's behind a wall.
I appreciate that. And, I've got to be honest with you. I think, at least in the families that I've worked with, and I wonder if the families that come to you have already done so much digging and homeworking that they were already aware. Most of the families I worked with, sadly, had no idea there was mold. And I mean, I think it's probably like close to 80% of families don't know there's mold. And I'll give you two examples. Like, we had two cases where one sweet little girl was constantly getting sick, also not growing, having some behavioral issues. And, we did some initial testing, and the testing started hinting at mold. And, in my world, one of the things that I find, and one of the greatest challenges I see, is that mold is really hard to diagnose if you don't know what you're doing. It's very, very easy to miss. And I've had families where, they went to go see the biggest bigwig pediatrician in the country. Literally, they flew to, Mayo Clinic, or they went to, some other very well-known integrative centers, $5,000 worth of testing later. They still didn't have a diagnosis, and the kid still wasn't getting better. And literally, I went through the same tests that were already done. I'm like, oh, there's mold here. They're like, what do you mean? And there was like weird blood cell counts and weird histamine levels. And long story short, without really getting into it, what I can say is, as a medical professional, I have found mold to be one of the hardest things to detect, unless you know exactly what you're doing and you know which test to order. All of this to highlight, there's probably a decent chance that a lot of families are going to even a well-intending integrative pediatrician or physician, and the physician orders a urine test or whatever. They're like, oh, I don't see any signs of mold. It's probably something else. And it's actually mold. It's just you're getting a false negative. And, the second part of this is, even when I have actually said, okay, it looks like there's mold, and the parents do testing, and I would love for you to chime in on this, they hire a mold inspector, and then the guy comes and does an air sampling, in the house, maybe 2 air samples, and then they go and do something on the outside of the house, and they're like, I don't really see mold. The inside is actually a little cleaner than the outside. You don't have mold. And then I keep pestering them. And I've done this. Like, we've had some families where literally for 6 months, I was grinding away. The dads probably wanted to shoot me, if not strangle me, because they're like, stop pestering us. This is not mold. I'm like, you have mold. And then the third mold inspector comes, and like with one family, like it was the subfloor. And, underneath the house, there was god awful amount of mold, except they didn't know it. And in another case, the little girl's bed was literally right up against the wall. That was the only wall in the house that happened to have a leak from the window, and that wall was infested. But because they sampled way too far away from that wall, they didn't get a read. So maybe we could talk about one, just how common is mold in the homes, and what percentage of homes in the country have it, and then maybe talk about like what is the difference between your line of work versus the conventional mold testing, if you think that's a good way to go.
Yeah, absolutely. You hear different percentages to your first question about how many homes do we think in the U.S. Can be water damaged or otherwise have a microbial source. And, if you look up things like the World Health Organization 2009 mold report, you'll start to see that, 50% or higher is not an uncommon percentage. And it's bias coming from me because usually people that don't have mold issues or observations of water damage are not calling us. Usually there's some motivational push, but it wouldn't be shocking if that number wasn't higher. Think about it. How easy is it for a toilet to overflow? A kitchen sink to leak underneath the cabinet? Same thing for the vanities in the bathrooms. A roof leak. How common are these things? 50% seems a little bit generous, but I'm guessing probably between 50 to 75%. Enough homes have experienced at one point at least one event, and likely more than one event over time. And this probably resonates with families as well who have kiddos who are still learning how to use toilets and sinks. My 6-year-old literally the other day left the water running in the sink, and it's an older model and it doesn't have one of those overflow holes, and it was literally about a 1/4 inch from overflowing. I happened to catch it in time, and not homeowners, other parents are not so lucky. So this happens. And I think that's the other piece of it is yeah, so it's possible, it's very likely that a home has experienced, if not an actual leak, then there's the issue of dampness. So not necessarily a roof leak or a plumbing leak, but a damp crawl space. You touched on that a little bit ago, and having a huge microbial source potentially underneath the home, and now it can communicate into the living spaces above through gaps and cracks, that sort of thing. I think where to kind of tactfully transition into your second question about, you mentioned a story about the spore trap example, the air samples that were done, they didn't find anything, and how that a lot of times is the classic example where a doctor with your background is seeing the evidence of mold exposure, but the classical mold inspector is missing it. They're not identifying it. And that therein lies the challenge too, is, well, is he or she missing it or not? There's been a paradigm shift in the way that an IEP or a mold inspector thinks today versus how a lot of folks have been trained in the past. It feels like the old model was two points here. Number one, it was more like it's not there if you can't prove it. So it was like I'm going to say it's not an issue unless it's obvious. Whereas the generational today, especially folks like myself who are working with people with chronic illness or low dose environmental exposure concerns, are flipping it. They're saying, okay, well, this is not black and white, but that is interesting how that one sample was slightly elevated compared to the other areas, even though the classic example is the inspector who says, well, we took outdoor control samples for mold to compare the indoor-outdoor relationships. And a lot of times they'll say if it's not 10 times or higher than the outdoors, they're not going to worry about it. And they even go as far as telling you not to worry about it, which there's a lot of things wrong with that. But the point is the critical thinking skills have evolved. Instead of making it a prove it to have an issue, it's more like your Sherlock Holmes. Why is this slightly elevated? Because every sample, and this is the second issue, have limitations. A spore trap sample, most of us, when we think about mold, we think about spores. That's what you hear about, spores. You don't think about hyphal fragments or other fragments of the mold. But what many people don't realize, and this is huge, is that for every one mold spore that you have from a source inside, there's anywhere between 300 and 1,000 fragments, way more fragments. If you're having trouble understanding what I mean by fragments, imagine if that spore, somebody took a hammer to it and busted it up into a few hundred fragments, or other structures of a mold. A lot of time mold looks like a tree. It's got the roots, it's got the trunk, it's got the branches, it's got the spores or the leaves. Imagine if any of that has broken down into fragments, which is naturally what mold does over time. Well, here's where I'm going with this. Traditional spore trap air sampling, which is probably the most common method of sampling your environment in the air for mold, doesn't look for any of those fragments. It misses it. And so you can have, say, for example, a hidden source that has fragmented over time, enter into the environment in medium, high quantities, enough to cause exposure concerns, and flat out be missed with traditional sampling that's just not looking for it. So between having the critical thinking and not, prove it or it's not there, like getting rid of that mentality, and also understanding the limitations of these samples that we have access to, makes a lot of times the difference between finding a problem and missing a problem.
And this doesn't even account for the mold toxins, right? Because that's a whole other animal in of itself. So you've got the spores, you've got the segments of the mold, and then you've got the toxins that they're producing, and that is also being missed.
Right. One of the see mold. It's funny, right? It can be such an easy thing to get through and succeed, and there's a lot of hope in all this, but there's a lot that people just have a hard time understanding. We live in a world where we're surrounded by mold. You and I, as we're talking, are breathing in normal background levels of mold spores, mold fragments, mycotoxins, and these other byproducts, and it's okay. We don't live on a world where that doesn't exist. But to your point, yeah, there are different parts of molds that have aspects like mycotoxins, which is a secondary metabolite, that meaning that molds can produce them, but they don't always do mycotoxins. But a lot of the people that you work with and I work with, it's not just about the exposure to mycotoxins, it's also the inflammatory response, the cytokine activity, the atrophy that maybe can be created by various exposures when you look at the neuroquants and all of these other things that we're holistically as investigators concerned about. Where the challenge is not just an understanding that, okay, there's different factors to consider, is that there's different methods of testing, and people start to feel overwhelmed because number one, they don't know which one to choose. Like, do I have to do all of them? Which leads to the second concern, which is that they have a feeling that they have to do all of them. There are companies, for example, unfortunately, that are out there that promote this. I don't know if you want to use the term fear mongering, but this idea that you have to sample for everything under the sun, mold related. And so you have these people that are overwhelmed, and I'm sitting here going, well, wait a second, where are we going to get the most bang for our buck? If we're able to do a certain type of test, we can infer from that you're also having mycotoxins, and we can thus deal with, as an example, we can thus deal with the home appropriately. If you have mold growing in the house, there's a good chance there's also mycotoxin production occurring in that location. So you don't necessarily need to sample to confirm mycotoxins and spend more money. It really just boils down to the unique situation. As you might imagine, Dr. K, there's situations where maybe a urine analysis, and not to dive into practices or methods, but sometimes people are like, wow, I found ochratoxin A in my urine, and I'm wondering if there's ochratoxin A in my environment. There are methods of testing that can give you that loose correlation. I think at the end of the day, what these suffering individuals are wanting is they're wanting the quickest, most efficient way to locate the source. And if there's an easy way to remediate it and clean it up, then do it. And the good news is that you don't have to create some complicated process where the next thing you know, you're tenting your house like in the movie E.T. It can be a very easy, simplified process and steps, and you don't have to spend thousands upon thousands of dollars testing for the various types of byproducts that molds can produce, if that makes any sense. Absolutely. And we can break that down a little bit too. I know that was a lot to unpack.
No, I think you brought up really good points. And what's going through my head is, first and foremost, just having the awareness that mold can be a possibility in what is happening to your child and your family is probably the most important thing. Once you have that and you step back, you're like, could this be mold? Then the next step becomes like, okay, well, maybe we have a suspicion. And, I appreciate what you brought up in terms of the WHO and the prevalence of mold. I found actually a study from the EPA that was suggesting that, somewhere around probably 20 or 30% of homes have significant amounts of molds to the point where it could become a problem. So regardless of what the percentage is, I think the gist of the story is this is very common. Yeah. And that's one of the things that really dawned on me, that, this is a very, very common problem. And it's not to say you need a sterile home. It's not to say that you shouldn't expect to have any mold in your home, because that's actually very unrealistic and probably impossible to achieve. It's a matter of, I tell families molds are like, glyphosates. They're like pesticides or whatever other toxin that you're trying to mitigate. For the most part, we know, eating an organic diet is probably a good idea. That living cleanly and not exposing yourself to too many chemicals is not a bad idea, right? We want to do these things because these are all having payoffs down the road. Molds are the same thing. We don't expect there to be none because that's actually impossible. You can't escape glyphosates. You can't escape plastics. You can't escape these chemicals completely because they're ubiquitous. They're everywhere. They're in our food. They're everywhere. It's a matter of bringing the toxic load down enough to the point where the physiology, the human body is not struggling. And how you know that is if everyone in your family has fantastic energy, the kids are growing well, they don't get sick, no big weird digestive issues, no one has asthma, like then you're fine. Like your paranoia doesn't need to be there. Usually when there's mold, there's one person who is genetically vulnerable and their immune system and their ability to detoxify is just different. And sadly, the most vulnerable type of people that I see are actually the highly sensitive. So the highly sensitive person physiologically happens to be probably the yellow canary when it comes to mold. And what is it about their physiology and their genetics? I don't know. And I don't think anyone has that answer. But if you were to summarize like who is the most vulnerable type, the highly sensitive people tend to be the ones who are super, super sensitive to mold. And they're usually the ones that start falling apart. So it could show up as severe anxiety. It could show up as weird depression, weird memory problems where the kid can't learn, or there's an adult who's suddenly becoming demented, except they're like 40 years old. You could have weird digestive issues. You can have growth problems if you're a kid. Women have weird hormonal fluctuations. Their thyroids just kind of swing up and down. They have weird fluctuations in estrogen. You can get chronic fatigue that shows up that, and I've had families where I found it. I'm like, so how are you doing, mom and dad? They're like, yeah, we're just really tired. And we thought it was because, we have a baby. I'm like, yeah, except your baby is 2 years old and sleeping through the night. Like, why are you still tired? They're like, oh. So it's these weird things that show up that have no explanation. The kid that keeps getting asthma attacks and end up in the hospital, not a little asthma where you take an albuterol, you're fine. It's like the kid has asthma, gets a cold, boom, falls apart. Weird presentations that ultimately, when you look at it, you're like, that's really strange. Like, why is that happening? And then when you go, when you do that's when you start thinking like, well, could this be mold? And considering the prevalence of it, so if you go on the conservative side, let's say 20%, if you go on the less conservative side, and let's say it is 50, 60%, like you start realizing like, holy cow, there's a large percentage of our population that's being exposed. And when you start looking at this, that's when you start opening up doors of understanding. And again, this is not doom and gloom. Mike and I are not here to scare the heck out of all of you. It's to empower you to start looking at these things and saying, wow, maybe that's the reason why my kid hasn't been growing. Maybe that's the reason why my kid has ended up in the ER 5 times because of asthma attacks. Maybe it's why I'm losing my memory or whatever other things. And when you start putting this together, then you can stand back and say, okay, if this is the possibility, how do I start looking at it? And Mike, why don't we get into it? Like, should we talk about testing and like how people can start looking at their environment just by themselves? And I think that's the really cool part. Like, you can be empowered to do this investigation yourself. And I don't know about Mike, but for me, I actually, unless you have a guy like Mike, who is so well versed in the world of mold and is highly attuned in finding it, I've actually started discouraging families from just hiring whatever random mold inspector they find online, because chances are you're going to spend $400, $500, $600, $700 and ultimately not have an answer. Whereas if you do some of your own investigation, you'll start picking up clues, and either it's like, well, everything looks fantastic, or holy Jesus, look at that room and look how much of a mess it is. So Mike, why don't you, this is your area of expertise. So let's say families get to the place where they're like, you know what, something weird is happening to someone in my family. There's something going on and it doesn't make any sense. And it's like, when you get to that shoulder shrug place, how does someone like start looking around in their home? And you also touched on like areas where the mold could be an issue. So maybe you can help us better understand that.
Yeah, I'll do my best, and feel free to interrupt as we go. There's a lot of great info there. So it's tricky. Where does a person start when clinically or symptoms what is they feel like there's an exposure in the home. People know that traditionally you hire an inspector to inspect the home. And to your point, it's tricky because unfortunately, a lot of the supply of inspectors out there mean well. They probably can do a really good visual inspection, that sort of thing. But it's the interpretation of the environment that's the most critical, of whether or not they're doing sampling or not. And even if they are they interpreting it like the prove it case I mentioned earlier? Are they looking at it more in a Sherlock Holmes? And unfortunately, you think it would be you would think for a variety of reasons, it would be something that more inspectors would be willing to jump on board and be more critical. But I think there's a comfort piece of just having some black and white pass fail criteria to the average healthy individual that fits their model so they can just keep going to the next client. Whereas with the patients that we work with, you just can't do that. And so back to the issue of options, I want to call them elephants in the room, but there's a couple of things to bring up. There's DIY sampling, do it yourself kits that a person could start with. We know that there is a company that is known to send out Petri dishes, and you can sample the home looking for viable mold that is mold that's able to grow, and more specifically able to grow on the agar or the medium, the mold food that's on that actual Petri dish. And that's a whole other discussion. If we need to go there, we can. But the idea is it's not costly. For less than even a couple $100, some people can sample multiple rooms to look for interzonal relationships. What do I mean by interzonal? Well, we sampled literally every room in the house. I'm speaking as the homeowner. And I noticed that the kitchen sample was way more indicative of a problem by virtue of mold that was growing on the Petri dish than anywhere else in the home. Well, that might lead you to focus on the kitchen. You open up the kitchen sink, I'll be darned, there's some water staining and some dampness, and maybe there's where the mold source is at. Maybe that's where that came from. And I am so simplifying this because there are so many anomalies and nuances and what is normal on that Petri dish. Or there's other situations where, yeah, it was higher in the kitchen, and the kitchen happens to be right next to the front door and the sliding glass back door. And so there's a lot more communication with the outdoor molds in the kitchen area, which might help explain why there's more mold growth on there. But these DIY options, the other one is ERMI, Environmental Relative Moldiness Index. People know it as the acronym ERMI, this dust sample. It's more money per sample, but I would argue so everything has its pros and cons. One of the major pros to that type of sampling is that it can speciate the mold, whereas traditional do-it-yourself Petri dish sampling doesn't speciate. So it makes it more difficult to understand or appreciate maybe where it's coming from. If you're a professional trying to understand, I know the physiology of this mold, I know where it likes to grow and that sort of thing. If you don't have the species, that makes it very difficult. The ERMI sample, which is a DNA-based sampling, does speciate, but here's a big one. It also helps identify those fragments we were talking about earlier. So if it's one of the 36 mold species that are on that ERMI panel, and there's DNA in the fragment, and typically there is, it technically can pick it up. These are great DIY options to start with. The problem is what to expect from it. There are people out there that think that mold sampling is as easy as 1, 2, 3. In fact, our industry, and I don't want to include myself on that, but the inspection, the analysis industry has kind of made the layperson think that. Why wouldn't they? You can go to a big box store and buy a Petri dish kit. And so it gives this feeling that it's a black and white interpretation. It's not. It'd be the same as you having a DIY kit for the line of work you do at your local CVS or Walgreens. And it's like, it's not that simple. It's the same thing with the environment. So you want to be careful whether you're doing, and again, I'll let you lead here the conversation, take us where it needs to go, but whether you're doing like the Petri dish kits, the do-it-yourself, or the ERMIs is not to feel like you're going to be able to solve all of the problems, but more to get a general feel of what ballpark are we in. And that's why I support it in certain situations, because back to your model, this example of most of the family members doing great, but maybe one person's not. The spouses are arguing over, I'm not going to spend this kind of money to hire professionals. We don't have a problem. I think you're just crazy. Does this sound familiar to anybody? This happens a lot. And so the husband or the wife is conflicted of what to do. They want to get at least some data. The doctor is saying you need to get some data because the clinical markers are indicating exposure. You can do that type of sample to see where you're at. But the word of caution, and this kind of leads back to the professional pieces, most people I work with that reach out to me are the people that have done that already. And they're either conflicted with what it means. Okay, we had mold grow on the Petri dish. Is that a problem? Or is that normal? Or an ERMI sample, classic. People are looking at the ERMI scores. And my personal experience is that I love the research that the EPA did with that. And I've learned so much since they first commercialized this testing option in 2006 because of it. But I feel like there can be a lot of false positives with a lot of the ERMI scores where a person sees it and assumes they have a problem when really that's just normal background molds that are coming from the outside. What some of you might be picking up in this discussion here is that, to be honest with you, if you can, you need to seek out professional help to guide you from the beginning. Don't get yourself stuck in a situation where you hire somebody who either doesn't know what they're doing, they're not that new paradigm of thinking, they're not associated with organizations that promote, awareness and education for chronic illness, that sort of thing. Don't necessarily trip over yourself and all of a sudden take 5 or 10 expensive ERMI samples only to realize you didn't collect them ideally for your situation. Slow down if you can and work with a professional, because there's a growing number of IEPs like myself who offer virtual services so we can quarterback it. We can help guide you. You don't have to be there for every second, but we can guide you with the fundamentals, the education. We can take a look at the specifics of your home and say, okay, based off of this, let's have you start with this type of DIY sampling, but we're going to have you do it in this specific way so we can get some really useful information. So much there with the different types of sampling. If possible and short, work with a professional up front so that they can guide you. It'll be worth it. I'm telling you, the education alone and that it can be applied to your specific situation is priceless. The other thing that you asked me, and I don't want to get too far ahead of myself, Dr. K, are common sources to look at. It doesn't mean just because you're going to work with a professional that you can't do some of your own recon, your own investigation, just to get an idea. And to be honest with you, there's some easy things you can do. If you have a crawl space, there's a pretty good chance that you have a moisture problem underneath there. Now, don't get me wrong. I know there's probably at least one of you listening that has spent $20,000 and improved their crawl space. It's got a dehumidifier, it's got drainage, it's got a moisture barrier. Life is good. But of a majority of people who have crawl spaces, it's just exposed soil and damp conditions. And you don't need standing water in a crawl space to have a mold problem, since we're just picking on mold right now. It can just be damp outside. We see this happening all the time. The moisture gets into the crawl space, condenses on surfaces, mold grows, that sort of thing. Looking in the crawl space, I don't want you to expose yourself a second longer than you need to, but did anybody notice any visual evidence of microbial growth? Did it smell musty? Musty can be a good indicator of active growth occurring in that environment. Beyond the crawl space, attics. Attics are often overlooked. I would say that crawl spaces, if I had to pick between the two, are less of an issue than crawl spaces, but attics can be an issue. In fact, there's a lot of condensation issues and lack of ventilation issues where you have mold growing on the roof sheathing or the trusses themselves that are just missed because most people never took the time to look up into the attic because they think, well, I don't live in the attic. I don't live in the crawl space. So why am I worried about it? And it's an issue because you can have a huge quantity of microbial growth in those environments. It's an issue of volume. Your classic kitchen sink vanities, I know I touched on them before. A lot of people don't look at those because they stuff their personal items and supplies and cleanings agents in there, and it covers and hides a problem. In fact, a lot of times people don't even realize they have a problem until they go back and they reach that one chemical that they need that they seldom use, and they look up and they go, oh my gosh, there's growth right here, and there was a slow drip leak.
Well, we actually just ran into that ourselves 3 weeks ago. We're in the process of getting it taken care of. But literally, like I've been pretty OCD about not having any issues. And then we go into the kitchen cabinet, the sink, and to grab something, and all of a sudden it's like, holy cow, what the heck is all this water? And literally there was standing water that had been there for God knows how long with all kinds of funky stuff. So we're in the process of hiring someone to come out and take it. And right now I've actually put a HEPA filter underneath the sink to scrub that air to whatever extent to mitigate our exposure. But yeah, I mean, it's wild. Like these things happen. And if you guys don't walk away with anything, if you can just walk away with, wow, we had a massive kitchen leak a year ago, and then 6 months ago, me, my kid, etc., developed blah blah blah, and we have no explanation for blah blah blah. That could actually be a reason. If we've had families where everything was fine, and then after the heavy rains, at least we had in California, which are kind of rare for us, sadly, someone got much worse. So the whole point in this entire conversation is for you guys to start thinking about this. If nothing else, just think about it, become aware of it. Sorry, Mike.
No, that's good. And I needed the break. First of all, sorry to hear you're dealing with that, and reach out to me if you need some additional help. But that's a great example. And so you can look at these low-hanging fruit issues without too much effort, not without spending much money, just your time and energy to go do that. Your water heater, if it's tucked in a closet, those can leak and people don't realize it. Their air conditioning system, if you are in a home that has not just heating, but air conditioning, so the cooling, maybe you have a condensing unit that's outside, it pumps the Freon to what's called an evaporator coil. That evaporator coil, which is the part that actually cools the air for you in the summertime and helps remove some of the moisture from the environment, is also a common place where mold can grow. Now, that's not always as easy to get to. You might need to get an air conditioning company, but if you haven't had your air conditioning system serviced in a while anyway, just for functionality, is it operating properly? That might be a great time to reach out to your air conditioning company and say, can you open up my evaporator coil? Do yourself a favor and tell them to take some photos versus just relying on their verbal review of what they did or didn't find, because that sometimes can be an issue. But have them look at the evaporator coil or the nearby ductwork. And, it's not just about mold growing in the evaporator coil. That, again, this is the part that specifically cools the air, but the ductwork that comes off of it. These are areas that you can inspect. You can look at your registers that might be in the ceiling or on the floor. Are you seeing evidence of what looks like suspicious growth? And if you are, these should be yellow, red flags for you to just bring awareness that, okay, maybe this is a source. At the end of the day, being able to do this low-hanging fruit inspection, going around the perimeter of your home, how does the drainage look like? Did you ever look at your irrigation that pops up in the morning on that automatic timer and find out that you had a sprinkler that was spraying right against your wall, but you never really paid attention to that? That happens a lot, and it doesn't necessarily reveal itself on the inside of the home, but yet you could have a major problem in that wall itself. Or drainage. People have roofs in their houses, virtually everybody. And you have gutters and downspouts that drain the water off the roof. Where does that water go? Is it just draining right next to your crawl space? Is it draining right next to some siding to your exterior of your home where it can wick up like a sponge, capillary effect, and have moisture come into that wall cavity and create a condition conducive for mold growth? These are low-hanging fruit issues for you to help identify. The other thing we want to stress is how we handle it. If you're noticing these problems or these potential issues, I wouldn't advise you necessarily trip over yourself to remediate it, because then we get into issues of cross-contamination and not making the issue worse than maybe what it even is to begin with. Yeah. But what it should do is it should be an alarm bell of saying, you know what, this is adding up in a way that says my home could be an exposure. And that's when you start reaching out to a professional to not just address any initial findings, the DIY samples, that sort of thing, but what are the visual things that we know about the home? What are the historic leaks? You could have a leak that occurred 15 years ago and the water was rectified. It was not an issue, and you can still have a microbial source at that location. It's not growing, but dead or alive, mold is still allergenic, potentially toxigenic, and can create that inflammatory response that Dr. K and I've been talking about. So we're not just looking for an active leak. We're looking for any evidence of current or past issues that might be really a location of hidden sources.
I really appreciate you bringing this up, because I mean, I've been at this holistic medicine business for a while, and heavy metals and metals in vaccines, and we're not going to get into vaccines, and glyphosates and plastics. I mean, I've had all of these conversations, and at one point in my life kind of gotten OCD about them. If I had to choose between someone getting exposed to pesticides, for instance, in the food they're eating, in mold, I hate to say this, I would actually choose the pesticides. Not that glyphosate is anything we want. It's a horrific compound, and I've talked to Dr. Stephanie Seneff, and like she's a world expert at this, and it's awful. I would argue that mold is actually more awful than glyphosate. And if you had to choose, low level exposure to glyphosate versus low level exposure to constant molds in any significant amount, sadly, the mold, I think, would win in terms of the battle of awfulness. And all of these pearls, guys, that Mike has shared are things that really need to stick in your brain. And I'll give you stories of things that Mike has talked about. We have families, multiple families that have bought these beautiful new homes, like 2-3 year builds, like not 15,000-year-old homes. And old homes have a tendency to get moldy even more. But we're talking brand new construction, to the point where they're like, when I told them, I think you have mold, they looked at me like, you're out of your friggin' mind. Literally, they're like, you're out of your mind. We just bought this home, and this home was not cheap. And brand new construction, fancy construction. And I'm like, well, you guys have mold. They're like, okay, we think you're crazy, but sure, we'll entertain your craziness for a second just to prove you wrong. And then all of a sudden, some genius forgot to hook up the drain to the air conditioning, brand new air conditioning unit, 2 years old. But because the guy had not hooked up the drain properly, the entire drain pan of the AC unit had turned into a mold cesspool. So every time they turn on the AC, it was just pumping mold into the kid's bedroom. Yeah. We've had families where also super nice remodeled home, except they were kind of on a hillside, and all the rains would just go right through the crawl space, literally, like, because that was just how the flow was, and there was no drainage around the house. So literally every time it would rain, the crawl space would just turn into essentially a greenhouse. Yeah. The attic he touched on, we've had families, one thing that Mike didn't mention, and I'm sure you've come across this a bunch of times, Mike, where the family had a retaining wall, and the house was built up right against the retaining wall, and the contractor that did that decided for some reason not to put drainage behind the retaining wall. So all that moisture that was coming from the hillside was going right through the concrete, right into the house, right into the wall. And it happened, sadly, that the kid's bedroom was right up against that retaining wall. They couldn't see the mold from the outside. Once they tore the walls open, like visible black mold everywhere. Right. So these things happen, and you can only start piecing these things together if you're aware and you're curious. Right. And it's not doom and gloom. It's not the end of the world. It's about bringing an understanding to why you or someone in your family is not healthy or doing well. And Mike, if we could, I don't know if there's anything else you want to touch on in terms of these examples I brought up.
You're just to say, you're right about the issue with elevation, landscaping, having moisture make its way, flood water, drainage water not being done. That is such a huge issue, because you're dealing with a volume of moisture, and that volume can create a number of issues. Also, is an easy thing for you to, without going too deep here, but from like a 30,000 foot perspective, for those of you listening, just a simple walk around the perimeter and just look, does it look like water pools near the house or near the crawl space? Do you have, one of the things we see a lot of is the older, especially in California, there's a lot of, and I'm not sure just by design and lack of thinking, but a lot of exterior cladding, vinyl, wood, whatever, ran on the side of the walls on the exterior all the way down to earth. There's no gap, there's no elevation. And so if there's any rain or poor drainage, it just wicks right up. It's not, this is stuff we learned in 6th grade science class. And so, major things to look at. But yeah, I'd love to move on and talk about some DIY considerations and that sort of thing, because I really want people to also know that while interpreting the environment can be tricky, there's also some low-hanging things you can do to bring awareness to your journey and go, okay, this is what I wanted to see or learn to make me better understand what my options are. And also to know that you're right, it's not always doom and gloom. In fact, those are really exceptions to the rule. The rule, doom and gloom, oftentimes has been met to me when people have already made assumptions about things. And when you reverse engineer it, you realize that it wasn't coming from a scientific research basis, it was coming from fear.
Yeah. And I tell every single one of our families, like, I look at mold as something that completely sucks. It's the biggest pain in your rear end that you'd ever want to have, but it is a pain in your rear end that you can fix. And there's always a solution, even if you're in a place where you can't necessarily remediate your home because you're renting and you can't get out of the place. We're going to talk about things you can do even in that scenario to help. But mold and its effects can be fixed, and they could be healed, and it could be taken care of. And this is one of the things that you must keep in mind. Mike, for 1 second, I want to just touch on the Petri dishes and the ERMI testing, because the way I've kind of shared with our families is with these little Petri dishes, which basically are where they help, mold grow. What I found to be helpful is for families to put them in every room, and to put one even in the crawl space, put one in the attic if they can get into it. And I've even suggested, and you may cringe to hear this, to run their AC and just put one mold plate up against the AC and just have some air blast into that. And my very naive way of looking at the plates is you throw one in every room. They cost $5. If you want them to get analyzed, it's like $25 extra. And then look, most mold plates get a few little pieces of mold and nothing happens. I tell our families, if one of your mold plates goes ugly, and they kind of laugh when I say this, but if they go ugly and all of a sudden there's like a black chia pet growing in one or multiple of those mold plates, that's when you can say, like, oh, that's really interesting. We've got a chia pet growing on this one. I wonder what's going on here. And I add to that to say, well, do the mold plates, and thanks to your teachings, also do the ERMI on top of that, so you can see if there's one or two rooms that are weird, or the attic or subfloor or the AC, and then you do the ERMI. And what Mike was talking about with the speciation is the mold plates will just tell you if you have aspergillus or penicillium or whatever. They don't tell you the actual species. And what's really cool about the work that Mike does, and he is really like this Sherlock Holmes of mold inspection, he'll actually, on these DNA tests, so with these ERMI, as he called it, you basically take a little Swifter pad, you pick up some dust, you send it to the company, and then the company analyzes the dust for mold fragments. And then they'll tell you, okay, this mold fragment belongs to this specific species of mold. And when you've got a really smart brain like Mike's, Mike can look at that and say, well, that species is really weird because that species only grows in water damaged building, whereas these other species of aspergillus, for instance, actually could just be from, the environment or whatever, that's not scary or awful. So what do you, first of all, do you cringe when I say, like, okay, stick one in the attic, stick one in the subfloor, have one with the AC blow? Like, did your heart stop for a second when I said that?
No, I think what it did, though, is it brought up a good talking point. There's this thing called building science and physics, and trying to, the ability to interpret a sample. First of all, I support the idea of, again, if you're just starting out and you're reluctant, for whatever the reason may be, to hire a professional or do more forensic. When I say more forensic, I'll even be more generous and say more costly sampling. That Petri dishes are a great way to start, because as Dr. K mentioned, per room application, one in the attic, one in the crawl space, can give us order of magnitude type of discussion points. It's not, if you don't have mold growing, if it didn't go ugly, it doesn't necessarily mean that you don't have an issue, but it is interesting to look for those interzonal relationships. I love that idea. Sticking it up in front of an air conditioning system, it just depends, because it's a different methodology. Now you're not relying on gravity and normal settling of molds to land on the Petri dish. you're accelerating that process by allowing air at 300 to 600 feet per minute to hit the Petri dish in a variety of ways. And depending on what is actually in the ductwork, depending on the filter that you have, and a host of other things, you may get a false negative or a false positive. In fact, I've seen probably equal amounts where someone assumes they have a mold problem, but really that was just normal background. You learn more about their system and how dirty it is versus not mold growing, but just dirty, needs to be clean. But part of what is dirt and debris and what comes from outside is mold.
Yeah.
Versus I've also see things being missed where they say, well, there wasn't really that any really grew on there. And it's like, well, yeah, because the stuff that is coming from your air conditioning system is either not impacting it correctly, it's not a viable mold spore that can grow, or it is a viable mold spore that just doesn't like to grow in that particular medium or food, the mold food. So a great starting point. The one thing I'll talk about, if you're okay, is this ERMI. I've dealt with so many different cases, thousands, where it really boils down to the personality, where they're at in life, financially, logistically, emotionally. And those are all important things for a good IEP to be a part of. First 10, 15 minutes of any call I have with a client is getting into those pieces right there to really appreciate where they're coming from so that you can communicate more effectively with them and show that compassion. That's important. Used to be just a novelty thing. I think it should be a requirement. To go back to the ERMI piece, what I was getting at is that I have a hard time necessarily recommending it off the bat, meaning before you work with a professional. And it's biased, and I admit that, but here's why. I can't tell you probably, I guess, 70 to 80% of people who collect ERMIs, upon diving into their situation, I realized that I would have had them collected a different way. Maybe avoid this area or this surface, or maybe clean the house first, but some houses you don't clean first. There are so many nuances. We get into the building sciences and what we know about the environment. Well, we just cleaned our house 4 weeks ago. It should be good. Yeah, but you used a cleaning service that used their own vacuum that they used in 50 other moldy homes. So maybe your ERMI sample doesn't reflect your home.
Got it.
Is why I'm saying is that I'm okay with the Petri dishes to start, because from a cost perspective, it's a low entry into the market to get some data. But if you had a choice, and don't worry, I'll still humor those of you that want to go ahead and do an ERMI, because I got some information I want to share with you. But if it's at all possible, I just assume you pump the brakes and work with an IEP. Let's slow down to speed up. And that's truly a term that's accurate here. It might feel slow in the beginning, but it sets the foundation for data and science. Does it make sense to pursue this? This is in layers. It's like eating an elephant, a bite at a time. And you may have a mold problem. And it may just be from that example you gave with the new house and the biofilm party that was going on in the drain pan that could have then been blowing into the home. Or it might be multiple areas of concern. Being able to even prioritize those things. How many of you listening suspect or know or have experienced having multiple issues, but realize that it was an issue of having to prioritize them? In an ideal world, you'd love to remediate them all at once, but you financially can't do that. So how can we prioritize that? If you're 8 levels deep in DIY sampling, assumptions, and fear, which I hope you're not, but if you are, that makes it difficult to rewind and go back the other way where the science is at, which is working with a knowledgeable professional. That huge disclaimer said, let me humor you with a few things to consider. One of the things that Dr. K reached out to me not too long ago was saying, Mike, these ERMIs are complicated. We've talked before about them. We know that you're not a real big fan necessarily of relying on the ERMI score, but you're a fan of looking at the individual mold species and their physiology and their quantities and asking the question, does this look normal for this house? Meaning just what would come from the outside. And I entertained that question for a while. And what I want to, if you're okay with this, Dr. K, want to present to the audience are kind of like Mike's top 5 mold species for you to consider. And again, this is if you did a DIY ahead of time and you're just really not sure. I wouldn't look at just that ERMI score.
So help us understand. I think for a lot of people, they don't even know what that ERMI score is. So what is that ERMI score, and why is that potentially misleading?
Okay, fair enough. And thank you for that. Yeah. So in 2006, I'll give you the short version, the EPA commercialized this sample called an ERMI. And it is right, and Dr. K is right, it was a dust sample. and they took it off the floor, and there was a particular way they did it, and then they analyzed it and they compared it. The study was 1,096 homes. And based off of that data, which is a whole other conversation, which we won't have, they created a curve and a scoring system. And this whole idea was that if you had a higher score, it was more indicative that you had a mold source, in plain English, in the house. That's the bottom line. Great tool to use in general, great research. I still rely on it for other reasons, but it never was really a good fit, this score. So you have 36 molds. You have 26 of those 36 molds are what they call water damage indicator molds. The remaining 10 molds, which make up the total of 36, represents common outdoor molds. It's basically group 1 molds minus group 2 molds gives you a score. That's it. So through all of this amazing data and resolution, you get a score. And these scores range from, what you commonly see is anywhere from like a 0 to a 20, but it can go up to extremes. I think if I remember, the scale can even go up to 50 on either side, negative or positive. But the point is there's been a lot of confusion. People that have gotten a score of a 15 as just a random example, but very applicable here, and they assume they have a mold problem. And why wouldn't they? They look at this graph, their doctor doesn't know much about the Hermes, and so they're concerned that their markers are showing a problem, and they assume they have a mold problem. But what we've learned as IEPs is that it doesn't seem to really fit well or correlate well with people with CIRS, with people with Lyme, with people with PANS or PANDAS, and the list goes on of these chronic illnesses, is that there's still a wealth of information and data, and that is the actual mold species. Never mind the score. Just what is this data showing? We already know it's forensic. We know it can detect those fragments we talked about. We know it can speciate these 36 molds, which are considered to be criteria molds, indicator molds, surrogates for
bad
other
actors.
issues. Yeah, bad actors, right. And what we have learned over almost 2 decades now is that time and time again, is that there are certain molds that will tend to show up more often to the party when there's dampness than other molds. And so if it's okay, Dr. K, and lead me as you feel fit.
Please.
This is great.
No, this is great.
What I'm about to give you are just some thoughts. And again, this is for that person that maybe they've already collected an ERMI, or they refuse to get help professionally and they just want to start with that. I get it. I've seen, trust me, I've seen it all. Is consider the following. The top 5 molds that I think offer the most indication of an actual source in the house is Aspergillus restrictus. And I sent, we'll figure out a way maybe to have it posted so people don't have to think this is a spelling bee. But Aspergillus restrictus, Aspergillus versicolor, Catonium globosome.
It just rolls off your tongue, Mike. This is, I'm really impressed. Like
Stachybotrys. A lot of people know Stacky. It's like the Tom Cruise celebrity mold that everybody knows. Even if they don't know that's the name, it's because they hear black toxic mold and all those things. So there's that. And then Penicillium corleophyllum. Yeah, it's a mouthful. But here's what I want you to know. And again, you guys will have access to these names of like Mike's top 5 is, here's what's interesting about these 5. In a lot of cases, when I've worked with water damaged buildings, whether on site personally or guiding people virtually, these molds are normally, just for the record, they're geometric mean. They're average counts that, remember that EPA study that I told you about was released and they commercialized everything in 2006? The homes that they tested originally, 1,096 homes, was done in 2004. They had another study in 2009, the same thing, but it was a follow-up. And the geometric means that were identified, meaning the average counts they were finding in these homes, were really low. So like Aspergillus restrictus, average count they found in the 2004 study, 2. 2019, they found 6. And I'm not going to do this for every mold, but it's the same type of thing where they're low numbers, which, let's stop and think about that. It's also a helpful tool because what we've seen is that in cases where there's an obvious source, a problem, a crawl space, an ongoing kitchen sink leak, these molds all of a sudden spiked up. They weren't so common outside, so they became better indicators of indoor problems. People will naturally ask this question, Dr. K, okay, I get you. You mentioned these 5 names that we can't even pronounce. where's the breaking point of quantity? Like what's good, what's bad? It's a trick question. It's a great question, but it's a trick question. All molds at one point in their life cycle, even if they grew inside, originated outside. If they grew inside, it's probably because it was readily available outside. There's no God or Buddha defined mold, whatever your belief system is, that only grows in a man-made structure. Here's my point. There's no hard line in the sand that says 19 spores of Aspergillus, to use an example of Aspergillus versicolor is okay, but 20, you must have an obvious problem. What I will humor you with is that I commonly start to really draw my eyes of attention on the Aspergillus molds, Aspergillus restrictus and versicolor, and the Penicillium choriophilum when they start getting above about 25, 30, or 40, depending on the climate. When they start getting above those numbers, it doesn't mean you have to have an obvious problem, but it just raises that eyebrow a little bit and go, okay. With Catonium and Stachy, these are two molds that are water loving. The technical term is hydrophilic. They need a lot of water to grow. They don't just grow because it's a little humid in your house. Those molds, it's a little bit trickier, but with Catonium, I usually raise my eyebrows when the number is 5 or higher in the house. And you might be surprised to hear this, maybe not, but with Stachy, I'm a little bit more generous. Don't get me wrong. If it's 5 to 10, it's got my attention, but we see Stachy commonly outside, because we take outdoor control samples, in the single digits. And so, but these 5 molds, if you had quantities that were just, again, this is a layman's interpretation for you to use, that were far higher than that. Aspergillus is in the hundreds, Catonium and Stachy above 10. This should be a really strong indicator that something's not right.
Something is weird.
Something's weird. And that you can then, you probably at that point should pump the brakes, maybe do that visual inspection, looking for some low-hanging fruit, and slow down and go, you know what, I think it's time we work with a professional. I want to talk about a couple additional molds, but I wanted to make sure that, am I helping answer questions?
I think this is awesome. I think this is awesome. Yeah.
Okay. So those are my top 5.
Okay.
We're looking at all the molds. We're looking at, and just because Stachy shows up on your sample and it's a 5 or a 4 doesn't mean we're dismissing it. I'm just trying to give you some low-hanging fruit stuff to use, because there are so many nuances with mold, as it's a normal part of our ecosystem. There are additional molds, Aspergillus penicillioides. This is a mold that, if some of you have done an ERMI before, you've also heard the term hurts me score, which is a Dr. Shoemaker scoring system. It's separate. One of the 5 molds that he looks at is Aspergillus penicillioides. This particular mold is, if I could use a technical term, a pain in the butt, because that geometric mean I mentioned to you before, where we were seeing like 2 and 4 and these low numbers, its geometric mean is like 91 in the 2004 study and 140 in the more recent one. Why does that matter? It's more common, and it's typically more common outside in warm tropical climates. But you pay attention to it. If you see, if you're in the 300-400s and you're in a dry climate, that's probably more of a yellow flag concern, meaning I should investigate this further, than if you had those same exact counts in Miami, Florida, or in Hawaii, where that mold is much more readily available outside. I'll go a little bit quicker. Aspergillus fumigatus, that mold, if you see that mold over 10 or 20, again, eyebrows are raised. I wonder why that is. Could it be a problem? Could that just be normal from outside? Aspergillus fumigatus is a mold that's well known to create aspergillosis in the lungs disease. That's not necessarily what we're talking about, but it's also a thermophilic, or it likes heat. So in Arizona, where I live, we have higher than normal background levels of Aspergillus fumigatus that you'd find in, say, Alaska, that kind of a thing. Aspergillus sandowi, this one is on that panel, is a very good indicator mold. That one's a little bit more difficult to interpret, but say anything above a 40 or a 50 count is a concern. That doesn't mean if your count's 20 that you dismiss this. We're looking for elephant in the room issues, order of magnitude quantities that are far above these crude guidelines I'm offering, which are almost impossible because we need reference to what is surrounding your home to have a better appreciation for what we would expect these numbers to be. Cladosporium sphaeronosphaeronum, don't worry, we're almost done, and Penicillium brevium compactum. These molds will be provided to you somewhere on this video cast so you can see it, and just look at them and say, are these numbers, these quantities, are they astronomically higher than the geometric means that will also be provided for you? And does that help you? Because I'd rather look at those mold species and use that to help me ascertain what's going on in the house than an ERMI score by itself. There are, unless you have follow-up, there are 3 molds I'd like to bring to your attention, Dr. K, and the audience, that are confusing and oftentimes misleading.
Okay.
So if you've ever done an ERMI sample before, you're familiar with the general layout of it. And you understand that there's these two groups, group 1, group 2, just to repeat, group 1 are typically considered to be water damage indicator molds. Group 2 are common outdoor molds, so you'll commonly find them inside. But don't let that group 1 column confuse you. And I'm going to give you a few examples of that right now. I mentioned this earlier. At one point in its life cycle, whatever mold species you found in the house originated outside. It's not arguing that if it's growing inside that that's where it grew, but where do you think that viable spore that germinated on that surface came from before it grew there? The answer is it came from outside at one point. There is a mold called Arobasidium pullulans, and it is oftentimes the mold on the group 1, that's the water damage indicator mold, that is the highest quantity of all the molds. Pound per pound, unless you have a unique situation, you will find odds are it's constantly in the highest quantity, and it constantly scares people. This mold is probably the most common mold that I find outside. It's very common outside, and it's in my professional opinion, a very poor indicator of a mold problem in your house. It does not mean that that mold can't grow in a variety of water damage situations, but it's so common outside, it becomes very poor to contrast and use. In fact, it's such an issue, and we can talk about that if time comes up, but I'm actually working with a couple colleagues right now on a study we're doing that we're hoping to get published that is looking at all of our outdoor data to bring awareness to this point that some of these molds can just be coming from the outside. That's a great example. Erotium amstelodami, this is another mold on that panel where it's the same thing. You commonly see this mold pop up in quantities on an ERMI. People see, all they see is a number, a quantity, and they go, my gosh, we must have a problem. All these other molds are in these double-digit numbers, but this mold's like 200 or 300. Mold is common outside, and we see it a lot. Wallemia seebi is the 3rd and final mold. Again, all of these 3 molds are what they call the group 1 water damage indicator molds. Wallemia seebi. And that particular mold is one of the most extraphilic dry loving molds. It can grow in a variety of situations, and it's common outside. So I'm not suggesting that if you take an ERMI DIY before you get guidance and you find these molds and they're, 5,000, 3,000, these huge numbers, that you just dismiss them as, well, Mike said they're common outdoor. What I'm trying to share with you is that you're going to expect to have some levels in the house, and it can be very normal, and in a way that hopefully comes across as somewhat therapeutic. There's not some expectation that on a sample like an ERMI, it should be non-detects, meaning no molds found whatsoever. There's going to be a balance. It's about slowing down, ultimately, my final point, understanding what we would expect to find in your home based off of where you live, the time of year, your cleaning habits, reservoirs like carpeting, that sort of thing, and determining whether or not that is normal fungal ecology, which oftentimes requires the expertise of somebody who knows these physiologies, who can compare it. Because listen, folks, if there was a cheat sheet, it'd already be out there, but you can't apply a cheat sheet with some sort of set number that says 19 spores are good, 20 spores indicates you have a problem. Because even in this long-winded explanation about these molds to you, your normal fungal ecology in your home, if you're sitting in it right now, or your office building, has changed just a little bit. It's fluctuated because of what's been coming into the home from the outside, and vice versa. It has changed. Hopefully this information of these technically 13 different molds can at least help bring more awareness, a little bit more clarity on, oh, wow. So yeah, the ERMI score might be as concerning. I would say that most people think that their homes look like a problem based off of the ERMI score. Look at these molds and see what you're seeing. And if that ties together with what your doctor, like Dr. K, is suggesting, it's time to saddle up and take a look and work with a professional in your home and take a deeper dive and see where can we find these sources to get you on with your life so that you don't keep spinning your tires, especially if you're one of those people who can sympathize with that.
Yeah, I love that. And I appreciate all these nuggets that you have shared. And we'll put a bunch of this in the notes so you guys don't have to sit there feverishly try to figure all of this out.
Yeah.
Like, let's say we get to a place where families are saying, okay, we've got mold. It's pretty obvious, but either we don't have the money to fix it. We're in a rental and the owner at this point doesn't want to do anything, or they did kind of a half-baked job, and we're stuck, and we can't fix this right now. And I can speak, from my perspective, because I'm really getting to a place where there are some people who are so sick, who are so absolutely sick, and they're so horrifically affected, and the mold burden is so absolutely high that ultimately they either have to remediate or get out of there. But I'm also getting to a place where I really, really wonder, and there are some people in the mold world that will cringe when I say this, but I'm really coming to believe that there's also a lot of people who have a mold burden, and the kid has asthma or has, some degree of, focus problems, concentration problems, whatever, that we can actually mitigate without completely having to annihilate the mold that's there. And I'll share some, simple tricks that I have found to be really, really helpful. In terms of detoxing mold, it turns out that there's a part of the liver pathways that are most heavily involved in detoxifying mold. And everyone has heard of glutathione. And if you haven't, glutathione is something helpful. Tricky with part of glutathione is that if you're really sick and you take glutathione, you can actually make yourself much more sick. And honestly speaking, in most of the kids I work with, it's kind of the last thing I bring in if needed. It turns out that turmeric or curcumin is actually a really valuable compound that helps rev up the liver in its ability to detoxify. Resveratrol, which you can actually buy for next to nothing, is a very important compound that also helps detoxify, and that there are combinations of curcumin and resveratrol out there. And if you go to a website like Pure Formulas, and I have no affiliation with these companies, you can type in curcumin resveratrol, and there's actually a mixture of that kids take that that can help. The other thing that I've really, really come to like is sulforaphane. So it's basically a broccoli extract. There's a company called Jara Formulas that sells Brocomax, and there's other ones out there too, that the sulforaphane actually helps create a degree of buffering or resiliency against these mold toxins by also helping to optimize detoxification. And then along with that, this has to be done under the guise of, someone who knows what they're doing, using a little bit of bentonite clay. It turns out the bentonite clay binds probably somewhere around 80-90% of the mold toxins. And to at least detoxify the mold toxins and bring that burden down, taking bentonite clay on a either daily basis or on a regular basis, just to kind of help bind and pull these toxins out, could be helpful. And I'll give you guys some examples. We've had kids where, these poor kids were like completely flipping their lids, and high intense anxiety, or we have a few kids that are on the spectrum where they were nonverbal and they were not making eye contact. And I kid you not, we started the clay, and it was just cheap old bentonite clay, and there are fancier binders that you'd have to work with the doctor to do, but cheap old bentonite clay in a milliliter, so a fifth of a teaspoon of bentonite clay once a night. After 2 weeks, like, these kids start talking. There are kids who are having like outright anxiety, panic attacks. And then like, it's weird, like 2-3 weeks later, all of a sudden the parents are like, my kid is calm. I'm like, what are you talking about? They're like, yeah, my kid is calm. I'm like, what? Like I still, each time I hear these stories, and I'm in disbelief, because I'm like, how the hell, like this was just bentonite clay? And they're like, we know. So all of these things are possible, and they're not expensive, and they're not, dangerous. And the clays, I would suggest you work with a provider, but taking some curcumin and resveratrol and broccoli extract, you're not going to hurt anyone. figure out the dosing, find someone ideally that can oversee it. But these are simple tricks you can use to increase the physiological resiliency to help your body or your child's body be able to handle these mold toxins more effectively if you're stuck in a place where you can't do anything. There's more that I'll talk about at a future time, but these are very basic, simple things that anyone can do to build up their system. Mike, how about on your end, from an environmental standpoint, what are things that families can do where they're like, shoot, I've got mold, but I can't move, I can't fix it?
Yeah, it's kind of a, not for me, of course, but it can be an uncomfortable feeling because it's like you're feeling like, am I leaving a monster in my closet, but I'm just removing a couple of them, but you still have that one monster. And it's like, how do I find peace and comfort? I think that the irony of that situation is that you brought up a point earlier in our conversation that I don't think there's such a thing as a mold-free home. And I don't mean mold-free from the context of mold coming in from the outside. If we could somehow just subtract that from the equation here, you're going to have mold on the house somewhere, lumberyard mold, mold that came in off the train, you know, on the wood, that kind of a thing. The odds that you don't have some old source that you'll never, ever be able to find is highly likely. And that also should bring awareness to the fact that we're not looking for a 100% solution, which then ties into this idea of how can we prioritize if we know we have some issues, but we can't get to them all the way, or in the case of the classic rental situation where either the landlord is not able or willing to do anything, or if they are offering your spidey senses, because you've watched IEP Radio's 4-part remediation series and you've educated yourself on some basics of remediation, as you find out, now this guy seems like he's going to get a spray and run type company that's going to come in and put bleach on it. What can we do to triage that situation? Well, in addition to what Dr. K is talking about, when we get to the environment, a lot of times what we first try to do is say, well, what do we know about the sources? Is there any way that we can stop at least the leaks from occurring? Or if it's under a kitchen sink, stopping that moisture is going to stop a continuation of growth, which is kind of an obvious benefit. Can you contain it? There's the short, simplified thought here is that if you can cover it up with plastic and seal it in place, while we don't want to create another petri dish experiment by covering up a local wall with moisture and mold, and then it creates more mold, we also don't want you to have cross-contamination concerns. And the idea of being able to even cover up an area temporarily until you've made a decision on what you want to do to minimize that exposure can be a great tool. But beyond that, you know, then it's an issue of, well, what can I do with my environment? I'll tell you, keeping the house clean, decluttering is a huge holistic, like taking a multivitamin type thing, improvement to your environment right off the bat. It's not just about mold. We've been focused on mold and it's certainly deserving, but there's other things that can be in the environment, just general particulate matter. Boy, that narrows it down. Everything that's a solid, dust, debris, plant fibers, the total soup, the total load, if you will, that your body is, it's like you said, Dr. K earlier, is we're trying to lower it to where your body can handle that load, is we're trying to do the same thing. So what do I mean by cleaning? HEPA vacuuming. If you have carpeting, if you don't have carpeting, HEPA vacuuming. Damp wiping with 5 drops of dish soap to a quart of water and a terry cloth or a microfiber cloth. Don't soak it, you know, wring it out like mom used to do, and wiping down all available and accessible horizontal vertical surfaces. Common sense applies here. You wouldn't wet damp wipe a book that's porous, but dry wiping with Swiffers. These are cheap things that people can afford. Unscented, we don't want the lavender scented Swiffers being used for somebody who's chemically sensitive, but an unscented dry Swiffer cloth. And you know, a lot of people know of Swiffer brands, and they have the wands that you can attach, helps you get to those hard to reach areas. Just a weekly cleaning of high impact surfaces, horizontal, and maybe even a monthly, more in-depth, deep cleaning to include like the walls and other harder to get surfaces will automatically lower total load exposure counts in the home. People also talk about, now I feel like I have to say this part next, but keeping the house dry. So if you suspect that some of the issue that you have in your home is condensation related, I take showers and there's condensation occurring. Now I got mold growing here, or you notice it on the registers, but you know, you really can't do much about it. Purchase a dehumidifier. If you purchase a dehumidifier, you can keep levels less than 50% in your home as a target. In a vast majority of cases, those condensation mold issues which is a low-hanging fruit exposure concern, will be eliminated, or at least the future of it will be eliminated. Bathrooms are a little bit tricky. Even using the exhaust fans are a helpful tool, but lowering the moisture. Another portable option you can consider are filtration devices. This is huge. Not only have you decluttered your house in this example, but you've cleaned it on a weekly basis. You bought a dehumidifier if you live in a humid climate. Not sure what your relative humidity is, your moisture levels are in the home. Go on Amazon and buy a $10 hygrometer, a moisture meter that gives you relative humidity and shows you what it is. Once you've tackled that, then it's the issue of filtration. So this is where it gets, maybe we'll just spend a minute on it here, is there's all sorts of brands and types out there. And there's all sorts of marketing terms like purification, and mainly purification is the number one. Technically speaking, purification is the manipulation or destruction of a contaminant. Filtration is just that, it's simple removal. If you want to keep this simple, which I'm guessing you do, I'm a big fan of filtration. So I don't want to go naming all sorts of brands, but I'll humor you with a couple examples. I don't care if you go online and buy a Honeywell 300, which is about a $250 HEPA filtration unit, so relatively affordable for what you get, or you buy a $1,000 IQ Air Health Pro Plus. Buying a unit per room, that's key. It will really help additionally lower those particle counts. These are the things that you're breathing. These are the things that your doctor's worried about. Will lower those concentrations. Some people ask Dr. K, well, but this unit, which is expensive, says it's good for up to an 800 square foot area. And I live in a 700 square foot apartment that's got 1 bedroom and a living area. Those measurements are not based off of somebody with Lyme or CIRS. It's a general model and tool they use to keep all the other manufacturers honest about capacity and that sort of thing. You want to look at these as a per room option. So without diving 8 levels deep into specifics about these units, if you're going to buy a unit like a Honeywell 300, buy one for your room, buy one for your living space, or maybe there's an office where you spend the most amount of time. Doing these things when your hands are tied and you don't have many options and you're just trying to get this place safe enough, combined with the types of things that Dr. K was getting at on the clinical, the health piece, and then tracking your progress, whether it's symptomology, or maybe you have a follow-up visit with your doctor who's going to look at a variety of biomarkers. That to me is the best way to say, despite not being able to remediate an area that maybe you know is an issue, is that enough to get you on the other side of the curve to where you can still continue and get better over time?
I love that. Can you touch on 2 things? I know the HEPA filters have different filtration capacities, and there's like 0.3 micron, 0.1 micron. Do you care like how low or fine the filtration goes?
There's a lot of talk between HEPA, which you're right, is it's a rating of 0.3 micron, the particle size, and being able to remove 99.97% of those particles, versus OPA filtration, which is even more. It's like, it can remove, I think it's either 0.1 or 0.3, but the point is at 99.99%. At the end of the day, the most you could, whatever you can do, HEPA or better, to filter out the air is going to be better than nothing. To be honest with you, to get perspective though, keep in mind that those percentages are based off of single pass performance. The particles in your air will have more than one opportunity to be filtered out. So if you're having a filter that's HEPA or better, OPA, ULPA, you're having superior filtration. Dr. K, we know people that build these box fan designs where they build, there's a name for it and it'll come up in a moment here, but it's a cheap option where someone literally buys a box fan and then you buy 5 filters, like a 3M Filtrete filter, which is not HEPA grade, but it's like it's kind of in the MERV 13 to MERV 14, HEPA being MERV 17 type filtration category. And they literally build a big box and they use that because they only have, say, $80 to work with. They can't buy that $300 or $250 Honeywell unit. Any filtration is better than none. So don't get caught up if you don't have a HEPA filter and OPA. Even if you have something that's the equivalent of like a MERV 13 filter, you're going to be removing way more particles from the air in total. And keep this in mind, the dirtier the filter gets, the better it filters. So, it's more clogged up. There's not a lot that can bypass. So I think that anything is better than nothing. I think if you want to have a target to use, look for something that's got a HEPA filter.
Okay. One of the things that Dr. Nathan taught us was also to look at possibly using carbon filters for the mycotoxins.
Yeah.
And if you can ideally get a HEPA filter that also has a carbon filter on it, that would be even better, because now you're also dropping the carbon, the mycotoxin levels by binding the mycotoxins into the carbon, which the HEPA apparently would not be sufficient to do.
Yeah, a couple points real quick on that box thing. It's the Rosie Korenthal box. So I mentioned that to you earlier. Corsi Rosenthal, that's the box. You can look it up. And again, maybe we can provide a link for folks afterwards to take a look at that. To your point about absorbance, I agree. When we're dealing with chemicals, especially if it's a chemical off-gassing thing like formaldehyde or other sorts of VOCs that are coming from the building materials, that oftentimes we are looking at devices that come with a charcoal or some other sort of absorbent that can remove those chemicals that otherwise would make it more readily through or pass through a HEPA filter. But again, keep this in mind. It's a great option. It's a great addition, but don't feel like you're removing zero chemicals if you're only using a HEPA filter, because chemicals, a lot of them ride on the backs of particles. And so if you're able to remove those particles, you might be able to limit your chemical exposure as well. But both options are great. If you have I think the issue here, among others, is budget. What can these folks apply? Good news is there's a couple of options out there for filtration units that offer superior filtration for particles and superior chemical removal. Austin Air Health Mate, the IQ Air Health Pro Plus does those two higher end models provide great filtration for both the particle piece of this conversation and the chemical piece of this conversation.
I love it. I love it. Well, I'm so grateful to have had this conversation with you and for you to share, all your wisdom with all the folks out there that are really trying to figure out what to do and they're not sure. And I'm sure a lot of you are scared and you're wondering like, oh my God, how am I going to manage all of this? So thank you, Mike. I'm so happy that we were able to have this discussion.
I appreciate it. I feel bad. There's so much we could cover. And as you can see, from those of you who are listening, holding on, each topic goes deep. Yeah. But the good news is that through all of it, the theme is really what we were saying in the beginning, is that there are way more success stories that unfortunately people just don't take the time to promote than there are the horror stories. And I see a lot. I'm in the mix of a lot. And so just know that, as Dr. K is saying, there is hope. Slow down to speed up. Don't overread. Who's made the mistake of going online on Google and typing in any symptom and reading the plethora of things that can create that symptom? I've made that mistake. Don't go online and assume that you have a doomsday, got to burn everything down. I got to go throw my contents out and live in a loincloth in a desert in a tent. These are so extreme, but yet sometimes really sensationalized by people who have gone through that. Maybe in the end they didn't need to, but this is what their journey did for them, is not the norm. The norm, and it's evolving more and more, is people are becoming aware, they're working with professionals, and they're able to slow down and come up with a game plan like anything else you do. Like if you were trying to plan out a trip somewhere, it's the same concept. I want to plan out how we're going to do this, how we're going to assess it, what are reasonable goals. If we do find something, how do we remediate it? How do we clean it? In what order? These are not too difficult things to do with professional guidance. It's a matter of finding a local team who can help you, or somebody who can virtually help you, so that you don't get stuck. Because that's where there's issues, is when a lot of people take it upon themselves to do their own testing, and then they do their own interpretation, and then they do their own remediation, and oftentimes those end in failure. But don't feel like you have to, like it's a death sentence. It's not like $30,000 to clean, because that's a big talking part, Dr. K, is a lot of people are complaining about, yeah, I get having a remediation company come into my house and remediate physical areas of growth, three-dimensional, under containment. That's all smart. But then there's the rest of the house to clean. That typically is an issue of topic. And you have options, folks. You have a lot of DIY options. Even just good old-fashioned cleaning could probably greatly reduce the levels in your home and bring you back into an area that's way better. And then you can track your progress as you go and confirm that, you know what, this environment has improved and I'm doing better.
And I think that's the thing, that ultimately this doesn't have to cost a fortune.
Nope.
Ultimately, this is all fixable, and that there's a lot of hope. There's a lot of possibility, and the strange health issues that you and your family have been dealing with can ultimately have a, I don't want to say simple solution, but a relatively doable solution. And I think that's what I want to leave you with, that there's hope, that there are solutions, there are answers, there are ways to understand things that were not previously understandable. And at the end of this, all of this you can fix. All of this can be fixed.
Absolutely. Well said, Dr. K.
Thank you, Mike. Well, thank you for your time. Thank you all for watching. And who knows, maybe Mike and I will jump on another call and get into some of these other nitty gritty details that we were talking about in greater detail.
Yeah, I'd love to do that. Give us some feedback and let us know. I know there's
please.
a lot of talking points.
Yeah. Thank you. You guys be well.